I'm Shelly Martinez, and you're watching the Pro Wrestling Top 5.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Pro Wrestling Top 5. Brought to you from the Wrestling Red Carpet. Starring the Showstopper, Shawn Valentino. Also starring Rich Twilling. Today's special guest star, former WWE Diva and TNA Knockout, supermodel Shelly Martinez. This week's episode, the top 5 Macho Man Randy Savage matches.
Ooh, yeah! Welcome to the Pro Wrestling Top 5. I'm Rich Twilling, your host, alongside Shawn Valentino. This is a very specially themed show toward one of our favorites of all time, Randy Macho Man Savage. And so tonight we're going to talk the top 5 Macho Man Randy Savage matches of all time from the WrestleMania era. And we're going to start with Shawn Valentino. And notice real quick that we're both wearing the shirt, the bandana, the glasses. Savage is a favorite of the two of us, and so we're very, very proud to do this show.
Let's get started. Macho Man Randy Savage was my childhood hero. He was my favorite wrestler growing up. He was the guy that made me a wrestling fan. He was the one that made being a wrestling fan cool. So let's go back to one of my favorite childhood moments. And this might not necessarily be a great match, but I'm talking about a historically significant match. So at number 5, we're gonna have Randy Macho Man Savage versus the Honky Tonk Man on Saturday Night's Main Event back in 1987. And what made this match so special was that you had one of the biggest heels of all time in the Honky Tonk Man in the midst of a historical Intercontinental Championship run. You have Randy Macho Man Savage, who had just come off a huge Intercontinental Championship run that made him a megastar, and that was when the championship really meant a lot. On Saturday Night's Main Event, which is one of the highest drawing late night shows, it used to outdraw Saturday Night Live in ratings, and that's why Dick Ebersol felt comfortable giving him that special time slot on Saturday night. So you had an incredible setting, and you had an incredible moment when you had Honky Tonk Man with Miss Elizabeth. You had the Hart Foundation attacking, triple teaming Randy Savage, taking him out of the ring. You had Honky Tonk Ben hitting Randy Savage in the head with the guitar, slapping Miss Elizabeth, which led to Miss Elizabeth getting, out of all people, one of Randy Savage's biggest rivals ever, Hulk Hogan, from the back, forming the Mega Powers, kickstarting one of the best storylines, if not, I would argue actually, it was the best storyline in WWE, WWF history.
Yep.
Yeah, the Mega Powers explode. It all began that night on Saturday Night's Main Event. Randy Savage versus the Honky Tonk Man. You guys have the WWE Network. Go check it out. I think it was either September or October of 1987. One of the great moments in wrestling history, the forming of the Mega Powers.
Very nice. And I'm going to go with a lesser known Randy Savage match and feud, and that is when he was in WCW. And we talk a lot about today about the older guys, quote unquote, putting over the younger guys, putting over the future. And back in 1997, Randy Savage recognized this, and he put over somebody called Diamond Dallas Page, a 2017 WWE Hall of Famer. He put him over, and it was at that moment that Page began his ascendance to main event status. He was a world champion about a year and a half later, and you can argue that Randy Macho Man Savage was the catalyst in the emergence of the main event career of Diamond Dallas Page. And he went over clean that night. Savage put him over, and so a match that Savage lost, but still I consider it one of his best matches of all time. And a point in his career where he realized my star power can help get somebody else over. And Diamond Dallas Page is a star in his own right, but does he ever get to where he got without Randy Macho Man Savage?
Yeah, I'd argue that that was probably the best feud of Diamond Dallas Page's career. It was the feud that made him a superstar, and it was probably the best feud of the year in 1997 in WCW. at a time where they were still riding sky high, but there were seeds being planted that the company was going a little bit downhill because they weren't creating new stars. They were taking WWF stars and putting them in a different character.
And the Hogan versus Sting feud took a long time to materialize.
Yeah, and I would argue that it didn't materialize because it resulted in an absolutely disaster moment on that same Starrcade. But
another list for another day.
Yeah, but Randy Savage versus DDP, an amazing feud both in and out of the ring, and that was a feud that made DDP a star, and that will show you a trend in Savage's career. This is not a guy that didn't want to do the job. This was a guy that made other stars. This is a guy that was not afraid to lose. He knew he would remain a big star because he was so charismatic. He was such a larger-than-life presence. And speaking of larger-than-life presences, we're going to go back to probably the biggest feud in Macho Man's career, and that will be not my number 4 match on this list, and that's the Mega Powers Explode. Macho Man Randy Savage versus Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 5. I would argue that might be Hulk Hogan's greatest match ever. I think it was one of Macho Man's best matches ever. I don't think you can argue that he carried the Hulk Hogan to a match that was memorable. It told a great story. You had Miss Elizabeth in the middle of the action. She was also an integral part of that story. And just an amazing feud that kickstarted at my number 5 match, and I would argue that ended at WrestleMania 5 when Hulk Hogan beat Randy Savage for the World Wrestling Federation title in an absolute classic.
And before I get to my number 4, we're going to go ahead and plug our unofficial sponsor, the very great, tasty, delicious Stone Cold Steve Austin's Broken Skull IPA from El Segundo Brewery. This is what we do every single time we do one of these broadcasts. We enjoy it. I hope you enjoy it too. Go out and get one today because it's the best IPA you're going to ever have. Seriously. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah? Okay. And in my number 4, it's going to be very similar to his, but I'm going to cheat a little bit because I'm going to have 2 number 4s. And my number 4 is Hulk Hogan versus Randy Savage at WrestleMania 5, like he said. And I'm also going to go with Randy Macho Man Savage versus Ric Flair at WrestleMania 8. And let me get to both of them. So, like he said, Hogan versus Savage at Mania 5 with Elizabeth involved. One of the best storylines and one of the best build-ups of all time. In fact, I would put it number 1. And another list for another time.
Yeah, that might be the biggest feud in the history of WWF.
We're talking a year-long build-up. And now in the age of weekly television and
that would have played out on an episode of Raw right now, probably.
Right.
It's ridiculous.
But weekly television, Twitter, everything like that, Instagram, the WWE Network, which we love, don't get me wrong. But Savage versus Hogan from WrestleMania 4, when Savage won the title, Hogan's in the ring, hogging the spotlight. And it built all the way up to WrestleMania 5, and even Miss Elizabeth saw, hey, I'm not going to be the baby face and be in Hogan's corner. No, I'm going to be in a neutral corner, because she knew too. And even Miss Elizabeth wasn't even sure whose corner to be in at WrestleMania 5. But we had a year-long build-up. It was one of the best I've ever seen. And you can argue that Savage carried Hogan, not carried's a bad word, that Savage and Hogan had the best main event of Hogan's career. You can make that argument.
Yeah.
And I just think that was one of Savage's best matches of all time with everything else that went with it. Now, fast forward to WrestleMania 8. Again, Miss Elizabeth, the catalyst, she's involved in the middle of this storyline between Flair and Randy Macho Man Savage. And it's a shame that that match did not go on last that night. It wasn't the actual, quote, main event.
It was the best match of the show.
It was by far the best match of that show, of course. And Savage won the title for a second time, back when that meant something, back when it didn't happen every other week. And Randy Macho Man Savage versus Ric Flair at WrestleMania 8. And you can argue too, why not go Hogan versus Flair, the dream match? But work rate rise and everything going on with Savage and Elizabeth and Flair and perfect, remember?
Yeah.
He added a lot. He added a lot to that.
Every character was played to absolute perfection in that feud. It was amazing.
It was amazing.
And
if you go back to Mania 8, go back on the network and watch it. if they would have ended the show with that, it would have been just fine. That would have been a great way to end that show.
It would have been much better, I would argue.
So my tie at number 4 is Savage versus Hogan, Savage versus Flair. And it's funny because we're talking about 2-3 of the best names of all time.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to narrow down a career like Randy Savage's to only top 5 choices. But
we're trying. And
he was just talking about Elizabeth being in the neutral corner, but somebody that wasn't in the neutral corner in the Mega Powers Explode feud was Jesse the Body Ventura. And that was an absolutely perfect example of commentary adding to a feud, adding to a match, telling a story, because Jesse the Body Ventura told the whole story. As this was playing out, you notice little subtleties, like, yeah, you can feel some tension between Hogan and Savage when you had Gorilla Monsoon and Vince McMahon, the babyface commentators at the time, just kind of playing it off like nothing was going on, but you had Jesse Ventura kind of playing that investigator role, always taking Savage's side, because he was a big Macho Man Randy Savage fan, both in and out of the ring, and I think that he really added to that feud and made it what it was. And I think Gorilla Monsoon and Vince McMahon being kind of like that straight face, baby face announcer, just that dynamic between the heel and the face announcer is something that's really severely missing in today's wrestling world, and it played out perfectly in that feud. And speaking of heel commentators adding to a feud, let's talk about Bobby Heenan bringing in Ric Flair at WrestleMania 8. Flair winning the championship at the Royal Rumble with Heenan on commentary, and possibly the best commentary any match has ever seen between him and Gorilla Monsoon. It really added to that match, made it a dramatic masterpiece.
And the best Royal Rumble of all time.
And possibly the best Royal Rumble of all time.
1992, Ric Flair winning the title. Yeah, Bobby Heenan on commentary.
Look at the talent in that match. You had Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Shawn Michaels.
All over the place in the ring at the same time.
Yeah, just a phenomenal match. And with that commentary,
amazing.
With Flair winning the WWF title for the first time. And then everyone thought it was going to go towards Hogan versus Flair, which were the two big stars in the respective top promotions at the time. But WWF decided to go in a different direction. I'm happy about that because I really loved one of the best feuds of all time, Ric Flair versus Randy Savage, and it resulted in one of the best matches in wrestling history. And what was the tagline of that match?
Woo! She was mine before she was yours. Woo!
Ooh, yeah! And that really told the story of that match. Savage, who is always known for being jealous about his real-life girlfriend at the time, Miss Elizabeth, but in the storyline there was a whole saga going on. He had just married her a few months ago on SummerSlam on WWF television.
Married in real life.
Yeah, they were already married in real life years before that. But Ric Flair came in saying that Elizabeth was his girlfriend before she was Savage's wife, and it really led to some riveting television. And
even the opening of that show, remember WrestleMania, the opening, Bobby Heenan's looking up to the Raptors.
For those centerfold pictures, which I'm still waiting to see, Miss Elizabeth. Where are the pictures? Because Ric Flair promised to show the nude centerfold of Miss Elizabeth.
Rick, my friend, and we've had drinks together many a time. Not this drink, although you should have this one. You never once showed me those photos, so what's up with that?
Yeah, let's see them. But, I mean, that was just a phenomenal storyline, a great match. It was set up to be a great match because you had the best worker of WCW coming in to the WWF, facing the best worker in the WWF at the time, which was Randy Savage. Both of them larger-than-life characters, larger-than-life personalities. You had arguably probably the biggest woman star in the history of wrestling, and Miss Elizabeth at the center of it all, and it just created great television and just an excellent match. Again, Bobby Heenan on commentary with Gorilla Monsoon, really putting over the story. It was just absolutely hilarious. Classic stuff, and I think it was one of my favorite moments in wrestling history, and that's why it's my number 3 match in Randy Savage's career.
Awesome. And the number 3 on my list is WrestleMania 7, career versus career, Macho Man Randy Savage versus The Ultimate Warrior. And before there was Shawn Michaels, before there was Bret Hart, before there was AJ Styles, Kenny Omega for you New Japan fans, there was Randy Savage. And Randy Savage could carry a broomstick to a good match. And I'm not calling the Ultimate Warrior a broomstick. But at WrestleMania 7, you can argue that that was the best match that he had ever had. And you don't do that without Randy Savage being in the ring with you. And everything that came along with that match, if you remember at the time, he was with sensational Queen Sherry, not with Miss Elizabeth, his real life wife, but she was in the crowd that night, not at ringside, but she was in the crowd because Heenan noticed it. And it was awesome. He said, "Hey, is that Elizabeth?"
Isn't that Elizabeth? Yeah.
She's in the aisleway, and Savage and Sherry were being carried out as if a king and queen would be, on the shoulders of some lesser known folk, some peasants, if you will. And Elizabeth was right there watching it. And this, how can you not think this is one of the best matches, not only in Savage's career or Warrior's career, which I think it's his best one, but we're talking one of the best matches in the history of WrestleMania right here. And Warrior won that match, which ironically, it was Savage that a year later became WWE champion, and Warrior was no longer with the company, and then he came back at the end of WrestleMania 8, but at WrestleMania...
Savage won the title, right?
Right, exactly, WrestleMania 8, but he wasn't booked on that card.
No.
So it was Savage that came back a lot quicker, and the reunification with Elizabeth, they got married on camera afterward. It was a fantastic match, fantastic drama, fans loved it. And then there was that one broad, you remember her? She kept crying, and she cried a year later, WrestleMania 8. It was the same girl, and it's almost like they planted her there. But there wasn't a dry eye in that crowd. And so WrestleMania 7, Savage versus Warrior, one of the best I've ever seen.
And speaking of one of the best I've ever seen, I'm going to go back to the match that made me a wrestling fan. And this took place just minutes from where I grew up in Sterling Heights, Michigan. This took place at WrestleMania 3. Randy Macho Man Savage versus Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. An absolutely iconic match. I mean, if you're watching this, you've definitely seen it. One of the most famous matches in wrestling history. The first great WrestleMania match. For years, the best WWF match of all time. One of the great feuds of all time, with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat being injured by Macho Man, crushing his larynx with a ring bell. Steamboat coming back to avenge himself and to win Randy Savage's most precious prize, the Intercontinental Championship, which was a precious prize at the time. It was the worker's belt. It was something that rarely changed hands, and it was something that signified that you're going to be taken to the next level of superstardom. And Randy Savage went on to become the World Heavyweight Champion after that. But that night in the Pontiac Silverdome, in front of over 90,000 people, back and forth action, incredible near finishes, false finishes, non-stop high-speed action, both characters in their prime in front of an amazing atmosphere. I mean, that was one of the great moments in wrestling history, and many to this day say it's the greatest wrestling match that they've ever seen.
And surprisingly, my number 2, not my number 1, is also Ricky Steamboat versus Macho Man Randy Savage at WrestleMania 3, 93,173. You can't watch professional wrestling, you can't enjoy professional wrestling without, 1, watching this match, and 2, enjoying this match. It was one of the best you've ever seen. Jesse, the Body Ventura himself, said in the middle of that match, "This is one of the best professional wrestling matches I've ever seen."
Yeah, I'm sure he ad-libbed that. That was not a scripted line, and it was just amazing. As you're watching it unfold, you know that you're watching wrestling history in the making.
And as you know, having watched this show, the two of us enjoy professional wrestling storylines. We like something that builds up to something, and that feud had been going on for months.
Yeah.
And the crushed larynx, and it was across the railing with the ring bell. Savage brought out the ring bell again in this match of Mania 3 while the referee was out, to suggest that, hey, he understands ring psychology. He knows what's going on here. Let's incite the fans. That's what it's all about. And not to mention Miss Elizabeth was there, looking lovely as ever. Georgie Animal Steel, rest in peace. He played a huge part in that match. And Ricky Steamboat became the WWE Intercontinental Champion when that meant something. It was to this day, one of the best matches of all time, and of course, one of Randy's best matches of all time.
Yeah, just an absolutely legendary moment. And speaking of legendary moments, we're gonna go to number one on my list. You already mentioned it. And this was not only a great match, it was also a great moment, and one of the most magical moments in wrestling history. And wrestling history is at the end of the day, wrestling is all about storylines. It's all about capturing the audience's emotions. It's all about the drama and the match building up two characters in an epic story of good versus evil. And nowhere was this better seen than WrestleMania 7. Ultimate Warrior versus Macho Man Randy Savage retirement match. It wasn't the main event, but everybody that saw the show,
It should have been.
it was a moment that everybody walked away with. Randy Savage, and I still remember Ultimate Warrior, in the back of his trunks he had something that said, "It means much more than this," with the picture of the WWF Championship at the time.
Sorry to interrupt, but not only that, but that was the first time and only time that I can think of in his entire career that the Warrior walked to the ring.
Yep.
Because it was career versus career, and he didn't run to the ring that night.
Yeah.
And he walked to the ring, and the announcers that night even said,
Why is that the
Bobby
Ultimate
Heenan,
Warrior?
why is he walking to the
Yeah.
ring?
Why is he not?
Why is
running?
he not? Yeah, exactly.
And yeah.
That's how you build that. Exactly. Go ahead.
Yeah, everything was just on point that night. It was just one of those magical moments in wrestling history where the audience was on the edge of their seat. Just a beautifully told story. Randy Savage dropping 5 flying elbows. Ultimate Warrior doing his finishing move numerous times. And let's just not forget that abrupt ending where Warrior stood up and just put his boot on Randy Savage and pinned him 1, 2, 3. And that was the supposed end of Macho Man's career. And that was at a time where you didn't see a lot of retirement matches in WWF. So
It was probably since Mania 3, right?
yeah, I think the last one we saw was on a big stage was Roddy Piper at WrestleMania 3.
Or Garvin versus Valentine. you like that, Smarks?
No, I mean a bit on the big stage.
Exactly.
This was probably my favorite match of my childhood because I had a huge crush on Miss Elizabeth. And I really loved that chemistry that Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth had on camera. I really wanted them to reunite. Even after the Mega Powers exploded, I was waiting for Miss Elizabeth to come back because she added a lot to that act. Even though she didn't really necessarily do much, she kind of just stood there and looked tentative. She didn't have to.
No.
She kind of had like that classic movie star vibe going, like a Grace Kelly, where, you know, she just stood there looking tentative and was supporting her guy. And you could tell even in that match, it fit perfectly in the context of each character. Ultimate Warrior, who was, again, he was the Ultimate Warrior. Randy Savage, the Macho guy, fighting for his career, and Miss Elizabeth sitting ringside, just hoping that his career goes on. Even though they weren't together, she still loved the Macho Man. And to see that story playing out on the grandest stage of them all, one of the great moments in wrestling history. The entire audience in the arena was in tears. I was at home, I was in tears. Just a beautifully told story, and that's what pro wrestling is all about. That's what we're talking about, the Pro Wrestling Top 5.
And I've said this before, but this guy over here actually takes off his sunglasses once in a while, and he does own tear ducts. So at WrestleMania 7, these came out, and there's probably 1 or 2 witnesses that have seen this. I've been his business partner and good friend for years. I've never once seen anything come out of his eye other than maybe he cut an onion, but he would never cut an onion for himself.
Not for myself.
No. So the number 1 Macho Man Randy Savage match on my list is not one that would be put in a category of, hey, this was a great match. But if you, and I know you do, everybody that watches this show knows that WrestleMania 4 made my list of top 5 WrestleManias. And so the number 1 Savage match on my list is versus Ted DiBiase at WrestleMania 4. And there's one reason for this. It's because he became WWE champion for the first time that night. And that meant a lot to me as a child, as a fan growing up watching. Somebody who, with all due respect that I have for Hulk Hogan right now, I was never his fan back then. And for the first time, there was a babyface WWE champion whose name was not Hulk Hogan in the WrestleMania era. And Hogan had held that title for so long. And finally, somebody said, hey, another guy can carry this torch. And he carried it, and he carried it well for over a year, or about a year, until WrestleMania 5. But the fact that he became champion that night in a 14-man tournament where he had to win 4 times at WrestleMania on the grandest stage. The only thing I have a problem with that night, and I think you'll agree with me on this, is that Hulk Hogan stayed in the ring with him, because him and Elizabeth, his wife in real life, they should have enjoyed that moment together, because they earned that moment together. Hogan was there, and I know it was part of an ongoing storyline, but at Mania, come on, let them have their moment.
Yeah.
So Savage versus DiBiase, nobody's ever, and think about it, it's the one time in the history of WrestleMania where we did not have an advertised main event.
That's true.
It was the one time. And you have 2 extraordinary workers. They're fantastic.
Yeah, 2 of the best workers of their generation.
But DiBiase was working for the 3rd time that night, Savage for the 4th. They didn't go very long, maybe 12 minutes, something like that. So it wasn't your classic main event. But Savage became champion. It was a historical factor that goes with that, and that's why I put that at my number 1. Randy Savage, one of my favorites of all time. Oh yeah. And he became champion for the first time that night, and that's why it's my number 1.
And that was one of those moments that, again, when you're looking at great matches, it's not always about the work rate in the ring, it's about the emotion it draws out of the audience.
Absolutely.
And the entire audience was on his feet every time Randy Savage came in the ring that night. You could kind of had that feeling in the air that this was going to be his night. And it just shows what a huge star Macho Man was at the time, because it was a Hulk Hogan promotion. It was all about Hulkamania.
And a babyface.
Yeah.
We're not talking about if DiBiase became champion that night, that would have made sense.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? But no, we had a babyface champion.
That wasn't Hulk Hogan. That just showed what a huge star Randy Macho Man Savage was. A mainstream celebrity. He starred in those Slim Jim commercials. One of the biggest stars and most recognizable names in the history of wrestling. Facing off against one of the best heels in wrestling history and the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. And outside of the ring was Andre the Giant, and coming in to counteract Andre was Hulk Hogan. So you had 4 of the biggest stars of all time, the biggest female star of all time in Miss Elizabeth, all on the grand stage in the main event. I mean, how does it get any bigger than that?
Biggest female star of all time. That sounds like another list for T5. We'll get to that one.
Yeah, we'll get to that one
promise.
sometime.
Want to add another note real quick. Randy Savage, one of the nicest guys you're ever gonna meet, and we've met them all.
Yes.
He was, rest in peace, one of the nicest guys you're ever going to meet outside of the ring. So, Randy, WrestleMania IV, WWE, and seriously, you're celebrating winning your first championship with your wife. World championship.
Yeah.
You know, he was Intercontinental champion, we know this, but, I mean, that's a huge deal. And so, and his wife, who happens to be the most beautiful woman in the history of the planet, outside of Grace Kelly.
My first childhood crush, Miss Elizabeth. And fittingly, we were both there when Savage got into the Hall of Fame. We were wearing our Macho Man shirts. And even though he was his biggest rival, Hulk Hogan was the one that inducted him. Who else could? Because those 2 were so intertwined throughout their whole career.
Biggest rival in and out of the ring, but also one of his best friends in and out of the ring.
Yeah.
And I want to add another
and bitter
story.
enemies.
I hope you don't mind this,
Yeah.
but we were at WrestleMania 31 in San Jose, and Leaping Lenny Popo, the genius, aka the brother of Randy Macho Man Savage, was down in the hotel lobby at the restaurant writing his Hall of Fame speech. And some guy walked by and he said, "Hey, can you help me write this speech?" And that guy happens to be this guy, the Showstopper Shawn Valentino. He sat down with the genius Leaping Lanny, and they wrote Randy Macho Man Savage's Hall of Fame speech together. So
it's just a surreal moment. I mean, Lanny basically had his speech written, but he wanted me to give my input on the speech. And I mean, Macho Man was my childhood hero. I had grown up watching Lanny Poffo, who was Macho Man's brother, and what was amazing about that moment was here was Lanny Poffo giving me his Hall of Fame speech, inducting his childhood hero, getting my input, and at that exact moment, who else showed up other than Ricky the Dragon Steamboat? And what most people at home don't know was the original plan that night was, after Poffo gave his speech inducting Savage, he was gonna jump off the stage into the arms of,
walk down the steps.
Yeah, or walk down the steps. He was gonna go. He was gonna go have a moment with Ricky Steamboat, because the careers of Ricky Steamboat and Macho Man Randy Savage were so intertwined. But if you notice at the end of his speech, he's kind of looking for someone in the audience. I was there. I know he was looking for Ricky Steamboat. It didn't happen, but just what did happen was an unforgettable moment that I'll treasure for the rest of my life, helping the brother of my favorite star of all time write his Hall of Fame induction.
So this guy comes back to the hotel room and he tells me what the speech is going to be, and almost word for word we mouth it later. So he's legit in talking about what he's saying. And for those of you that saw it on camera and weren't there live, once they cut away, they did. Poffo ended up getting down to Steamboat, but the camera had long since turned off, and it's too bad, because
yeah, it would have been a great.
That would have been a great on-camera moment.
But we just discussed some great off-camera moments with you at home, and hopefully you enjoyed this show.
And again, thank you very much for watching. We appreciate your viewership. The Showstopper Shawn Valentino, your host Rich Twilling. We'll see you next time on the red carpet.
Thanks for watching. We're desperately out of time.
Thank you for watching the Pro Wrestling Top 5. See you next week on the red carpet.